Thank you. Today, I'm going to talk about politics. And one particular aspect of politics that has been troubling me more and more. We see that there's something wrong with politics in America. It seems like the media is fragmented, the people are fragmented. It seems the extremes seem to gain more and more political power every day. I actually wrote a lot about the swing voter, created concepts that created the soccer mom microtrend. In those days, candidates reached out in order to bring in the swing voters, unite the country, and move forward together. Today, we're seeing something quite different. We are seeing the rise instead of the fringe voter and the campaign that systematically reaches out to get those voters in their fold and to win the campaign not by bringing the country together, but through a process of division. And I'll show you in a couple of minutes why the numbers of what's happening in our democracy, the trends that are happening across the campaigns, have created the strategic decisions that are being logically made that are tearing the country in so many different directions, and some of the simple fixes that could undo that. Now, there are 94 million couch potato voters. These are voters who are just outside the political system. They are eligible to vote, but they don't vote. They could fill out a registration form, they could show up at the polls, they could cast a vote, but they don't. And that is an enormous number of Americans. Who are they? Let's take a look at the demographic breakdown of those who voted, typically 130 million, those who didn't vote. If you take a look, looks like people who go to college have a high probability of voting. Most of those who don't go to college, 51 million, and this is in millions of people, typically don't vote. And if you look at the age structure, you'll see some younger people don't vote. If you look over at by race, you'll see 95 million Americans who are white vote and another 63 million who don't. 18 million African Americans who do, 10 million who could be brought into the system. 15 million Latinos who vote, and 16 million eligible who could be brought into the system. So, as you can see, there's a huge population sitting just outside those who vote. And this then becomes the tempting target for bringing out differential groups of voters as a way to win an election. Now, in the past, we focused on the swing voter. Typically middle-aged, suburban and exurban, middle class. I helped identify the soccer moms, a rising class of working women in the 90s who became a new political force. Typically 20% of the country in the middle. And the campaigns would reach out to bring those voters over to their side. That was what, say, the 96 presidential election was all about. Certainly, if you look at some of the following elections, a lot of them were all about how you bring these voters into the fold. And when you spend an entire campaign trying to get those people who don't support you into the fold, a miracle happens after Election Day. The country comes together, you have a governing coalition as a result, and you have broader support than you had, because a lot of people who almost voted for you that you tried to appeal say, I didn't vote for that person, but at least they tried to get my vote. I'm going to give him or her the benefit of the doubt. That's not what happens in a fringe voting election. Now, let's take a look at the number of votes cast in primaries. 30 million, 24 million, 30 million. 2008 was an incredible primary with almost 60 million. This also had a large vote at the same time, 60 million, divided in half. But typically, about 35 million voters participate in the primary system. Wow, there are 130 million general election voters, 226 million eligible voters, but whoever sort of gets to the 10 million mark of voters first in the primaries in the way they're structured typically wins. So 10 million out of hundreds of millions right now are determining one of the two poles of our democracy. Is that a problem? Unfortunately, it can be. Let's recap how this overall looks. Let's look at the overall politics by the numbers. 321 million people in America. 226 million eligible to vote. 94 million who don't vote, my couch potatoes. 130 million who typically are voting. 35 million who might vote in a primary. 17.5 million who vote on each side. And when you get about 10 million, primary's over. Thank you very much. 10 million out of 321 million people. Is that democracy as it was intended by the framers? Is that one person, one vote? Perhaps that's the standard, but is it the reality? Two things have happened that have had a lot of impact on our campaigns. If you're John F. Kennedy, running a political presidential campaign, you could run that campaign with $20 million. And of course, there's been some inflation, but even $20 million from 1960 wouldn't be the billions of dollars that are now available to candidates. When billions of dollars are available to candidates, they no longer have to just take out ads in a few swing states. They can decide to mobilize new populations aided by their friend, the internet, and social media. And spending on the internet and social media has also gone from practically nothing to billions of dollars. Again, the hope is more speech and more use of the internet and more political involvement would equal more democracy. And it would if we had near universal participation in our system. And if campaign managers didn't discover an alternate route to winning with swing voters. They have a choice if they're the campaign manager. Go for the swing voters, try to reunite the country, or just get off the couch one sliver of those couch potatoes. We don't want to bring in, at least they don't want to bring in all the couch potatoes. They just want to bring in a little slice, a slice that they energize. So the old math was if it was 5-5, a swing voter who changes would make it 6-4. The new math, it's 5-5, bring in your sliver, and it's 6-5. And because they have the money and the internet to bring in a sliver, they can now run campaigns on religion, identity, grievance, base appeal, the things that will bring in one sliver, the things that seem to be dividing us instead of uniting us, now become a strategic way to win. And campaigns are dividing us instead of uniting us. And what an election is supposed to be is a good, tough, honest fight, followed by the country getting together behind their leader. So we got to make some changes. We got to turn that 94 million down, let's get it down to 44 million. We don't have to mandate universal voting. A lot of people might not like the idea of mandating universal voting. But we've got to get the strategic choice back to bringing in the swing voters. And we also then have got to up the number of people who actually participate. With 180 million participating, our electorate might look different, but the campaigns will be focusing on those who don't agree with them and those in the middle. And it will be pointless to try to bring in 3 or 4% that amounts to too small a number once you reduce that number down. And those primaries, we got to have more voters in the primaries so that 1 million voters that you bring in through divisiveness won't decide the primary. We've got to turn that 10 million number and make it much closer to at least 20 million. So that our democracy is driven not to extremes by activists, but to what it's supposed to do, represent the general viewpoint of Americans, which is the absolute fundamental bedrock of our representative democracy. So how are we going to do this? We're going to have to begin to reform the system. There's 2 principal ways to do that. Rethink voting. What is this registration, motor voter? People get a Social Security card when they're born. Give them a registration card. The day they're born, have it at the hospital. Make it something you're proud of. Make it something that becomes eligible and workable when you're 18, but something you get all the way back. What is this voting on Tuesdays? Start this thing, give it a whole weekend. I'm not a big fan of early voting. I like people to hear the whole campaign. I like them to make their decision at the end, but maybe give them a weekend. Saturday morning till Sunday night. Let America vote. Let them have that common experience of voting. And what is it with these precincts and these long lines? Figure out some more interesting way to make voting safe and secure. Maybe one day we'll get to internet voting. Hey, there's ATM machines on virtually every corner. They're secure enough to give out money. You don't think they could take a vote? You don't think that we could come up with secure ways to make voting easy if we were going to invent voting today instead of inventing it hundreds of years ago in an agrarian economy? Wouldn't we disrupt voting as easily as everything else has been disrupted? Of course we would. So we'd rethink voting to make it fair, to make it easy, to make registration something that follows people from day one, and would reinvent it. And that wouldn't require everyone to vote, but I think it would achieve the basic change that I want to see, which is more people routinely in the system and a focus on swing voters and making every vote count instead of reaching up for couch potatoes. And what about the primary system? As you can see, a small percentage of those people, even who typically vote, let alone those eligible to vote, are participating in the primaries. I always say, red and white wine, the only other thing in society where we just have 2 choices. We've got to be clear that if we're going to have 2 choices, that those choices have to be more democratic in nature. Caucuses, they're a lot of fun, but they have 25% of the participation of even a primary. Is that democracy? Or is that something that we have to replace? Starting in 1 or 2 states and giving those states the keys to the presidential kingdom. Does that make sense? An awful lot of nominees who got experience in Massachusetts in the State House or in the Senate, because that happens to be in the media market of New Hampshire. Whether it's Kennedy or Dukakis or others, they were great people. But shouldn't we have primaries that rotate their initiating point? Sometimes in the South, sometimes in the North, sometimes in the West. Shouldn't we use the diversity of America to our advantage in structuring the primary political system and in making every single vote count? Yes, we should. It's simple. But most of the people who win come through this system. And they look back and say, it produced me. It's not such a bad system after all. So we need some real radical thinking about these simple matters. Rethinking voting, rethinking the primary system, and the effect of these very simple changes is unbelievable, because it's not just bringing more people into the system. It's taking the value of divisive politics out of the system. It's taking the value of going for that little sliver of those couch potatoes, the fringe voter. It's taking down the fringe voter rise and restoring swing as king. And that's how I believe we should change our system, bring America back together again, and make the system more fundamentally democratic, as it should and could be. Thank you.